This channel examines the Jeffrey Epstein case using court documents, public records, and verified reporting. We do not speculate. We do not accuse. We document what exists, and what remains unanswered. Everything presented here is drawn from publicly available sources. This is not a theory channel. This is the file. Before it became a global symbol of controversy, the island was simply another private property in the Caribbean. Located in the U.S. Virgin Islands, the small island known as Little St. James was purchased by Jeffrey Epstein in 1998. At the time, the acquisition did not attract widespread attention. Wealthy individuals frequently purchase remote properties in the Caribbean for privacy, tourism investment, or personal retreats. Epstein's purchase followed that familiar pattern. Property records confirm the transaction. Over the following years, construction permits and development filings documented the transformation of the island. Buildings appeared, residential structures, guest houses, docks, and support facilities. Satellite imagery and aerial photographs later confirmed the physical expansion. From a legal standpoint, the island was privately owned real estate. Nothing about that status was unusual. Private islands exist across the Caribbean, owned by business magnates, celebrities, and corporations. They are governed by local law, subject to building permits, environmental regulations, and property taxes. On paper, Little St. James fit comfortably within that system. But ownership alone does not create public interest. For years, the island remained largely outside global attention. Boats arrived at its docks. Aircraft landed on nearby islands before guests traveled by boat. Construction crews, maintenance workers, and property managers moved in and out as part of routine operations. Local government filings recorded development activities. Maritime routes to the island were visible. Satellite imagery was publicly accessible. The location itself was not hidden. What remained private was what happened within the boundaries of the property. Private property law creates a barrier between public visibility and internal activity. Unless criminal conduct is reported or investigated, events inside private estates remain largely outside public scrutiny. That legal structure existed long before Epstein acquired the island. And for years, it remained intact. Only after allegations against Epstein became widely known did the island transform in public perception, from secluded property to central symbol in a criminal investigation. The physical location had not changed. But its meaning had. Understanding what is documented about the island requires separating confirmed facts from later narratives. Property ownership, construction records, and satellite imagery provide certain pieces of the timeline. Other claims require legal evidence. And that distinction is where the story begins. After acquiring Little St. James in 1998, Epstein began developing the island in ways that were visible through official records. Construction projects require permits, even on private islands. In the U.S. Virgin Islands, building approvals, environmental reviews, and infrastructure requests are documented through territorial agencies. Over time, these filings created a traceable record of expansion on the property. Permits showed plans for multiple structures. Residential buildings were constructed, including a large main residence and several guest accommodations. Auxiliary facilities followed: maintenance buildings, staff housing, docks, and recreational areas. Satellite imagery from the early 2000s onward confirms these changes, showing how the island's landscape gradually shifted from relatively undeveloped terrain to a more complex estate. The physical layout of the island became clearer through these sources. A central residence sat on elevated ground overlooking the coastline. Nearby were additional guest structures connected by narrow roads and pathways. Docks extended into the surrounding water, allowing boats to arrive from nearby islands such as St. Thomas. The location itself was practical for private travel. Aircraft could land at the Cyril E. King Airport on St. Thomas, after which visitors could travel by boat to Little St. James in a short trip across the water. This logistical setup allowed guests and staff to reach the island without the need for a dedicated airstrip. Again, none of these elements were inherently unusual. Private estates throughout the Caribbean often develop similar infrastructure to accommodate guests and operations. Dock access, multiple residences, and support buildings are standard features of large island properties. What distinguishes Little St. James in public discussion is not its physical design alone. It is how that design was interpreted later, after criminal allegations against Epstein became widely known. When investigators and journalists began examining the island more closely, the layout gained new significance. Buildings were mapped, satellite images were analyzed, testimonies referenced specific locations on the property. But those interpretations came years after the construction itself. At the time the buildings were erected, the development process appeared routine within property and planning frameworks. Permits were filed, structures were completed, the estate took shape. Only later did the geography of the island become central to public investigation. Little St. James did not exist in isolation. Although it appeared remote, the island was closely connected to regional transportation routes. Documented travel patterns show how guests, staff, and service providers could reach the property using nearby infrastructure. The primary gateway was the island of St. Thomas. Commercial flights from major U.S. cities routinely arrive at Cyril E. King Airport, the main aviation hub of the U.S. Virgin Islands. From there, travelers can access a network of marinas and private docks along the coastline. The distance from St. Thomas to Little St. James is short, only a few miles across the water. Boat transfers therefore became the final step of the journey. Maritime records and local accounts confirm that vessels regularly moved between St. Thomas and the island. Staff transportation, deliveries, and visiting guests could all be handled through these short crossings. This logistical structure is typical for private islands in the Caribbean. Many owners rely on nearby populated islands for airports, supplies, and labor. The private island itself functions as the residential or recreational center, while nearby communities provide the infrastructure necessary to sustain it. Little St. James followed that same model. In addition to maritime access, aviation records show that Epstein frequently traveled through nearby airports using private aircraft. These aircraft did not land on Little St. James itself. The island has no runway, but passengers could easily transfer by boat after arriving at regional airfields. Travel documentation therefore forms a layered pattern. Flights to regional airports, ground transportation to marinas, boat transfers to the island. Each step leaves different kinds of records. Air traffic systems track aircraft movements. Airport facilities maintain operational logs. Maritime operators document vessel activity. None of these systems individually capture a complete picture, but together they outline how access to the island functioned. For years, these movements attracted little attention. Transporting guests to a private Caribbean property was not inherently suspicious. Similar travel patterns occur daily across the region among tourists, property owners, and resort operators. Only after Epstein's legal troubles became widely known did investigators begin examining these routes more carefully. Travel records were revisited, flight logs were scrutinized, maritime access points were mapped against timelines described in legal complaints. The same transportation network that once facilitated routine travel suddenly became evidence to be interpreted. And that interpretation raised new questions about how frequently the island was visited, and by whom. As investigations into Epstein expanded, Little St. James became more than a private residence in legal discussions. It became a location referenced in testimony. Court filings connected to civil lawsuits and federal investigations include statements from individuals who described time spent on the island. These documents form part of the public legal record and provide some of the most direct descriptions of activities associated with the property. Testimony in civil litigation alleged that minors were transported to various Epstein residences, including properties in Florida, New York, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. In some accounts, Little St. James was described as one of the locations where abuse occurred. These statements appear in sworn complaints and depositions filed in court. That distinction matters. Legal testimony is subject to procedural standards. Statements are given under oath, and opposing parties have opportunities to challenge claims during litigation. While civil cases differ from criminal trials in their evidentiary thresholds, they still produce formal records. Those records shape the island's reputation. Investigators reviewing Epstein's activities considered multiple properties within his network. Little St. James, because of its seclusion, became a focal point in public discussion. The island's physical isolation, once marketed as privacy, was now interpreted as potential concealment. Law enforcement actions reinforced that focus. In 2019, after federal charges were filed against Epstein, authorities executed search warrants on several of his properties. Investigators later conducted searches on Little St. James as part of ongoing inquiries. Reports confirmed the collection of materials, though detailed inventories were not fully released to the public. Civil litigation also continued after Epstein's death. Victims filed lawsuits against Epstein's estate and associated entities in the U.S. Virgin Islands. These proceedings generated additional documents describing travel, property management, and alleged activities connected to the island. However, it is important to recognize the limits of documentation. Testimony describes experiences and allegations, but not every claim results in a criminal conviction tied to a specific location. Courts weigh evidence within defined legal frameworks, and some details remain contested or unresolved. What the legal record does establish is that Little St. James appeared repeatedly in sworn statements and investigative actions. That alone transformed the island's public meaning. Once a secluded estate, it became a place referenced in legal proceedings and media coverage around the world. And with each document filed, the timeline surrounding the island became more complex. Long before investigators physically entered Little St. James, the island had already been observed from above. Satellite imagery and aerial photography offered a form of documentation that existed outside legal filings or witness testimony. These images, captured over time by commercial mapping services and independent photographers, created a visual record of the island's physical development. Anyone with access to satellite mapping platforms could see the estate. Structures appeared gradually across different years of imagery. Early photographs from the late 1990s showed relatively limited construction. Over time, additional buildings, roads, and docks became visible. Journalists and researchers later used these images to study the layout of the island. Mapping tools allowed observers to compare different years of imagery side by side. Roads could be traced between buildings. Dock expansions could be measured. The positioning of the main residence relative to guest structures became easier to understand. This kind of analysis is common in investigative journalism. Satellite imagery has been used in countless contexts, from environmental monitoring to conflict reporting. In the case of Little St. James, it helped reporters visualize a property that most members of the public would never physically visit. But imagery has limits. Photographs taken from space reveal structures and geography. They do not reveal what happens inside buildings. They cannot confirm conversations, events, or intentions. What they provide is context. For example, images confirmed the existence of multiple residences, pathways connecting different parts of the island, and dock facilities capable of receiving boats from nearby islands. These physical features aligned with descriptions appearing in property records and building permits. The images also helped journalists track later changes. After Epstein's arrest in 2019, aerial photographs captured law enforcement presence and construction activity related to security and investigation efforts. News organizations published these images to illustrate developments on the island as legal proceedings unfolded. Again, the images themselves did not prove wrongdoing. They documented geography and infrastructure. But when combined with testimony, travel records, and legal filings, the visual evidence helped create a clearer understanding of the island's environment. Little St. James was no longer an unseen private estate. It had become a location studied through documents, testimony, and imagery, each providing a different piece of the record. And as more sources were examined, the island's role in the broader investigation became increasingly defined. When federal prosecutors charged Epstein in July 2019, attention quickly turned to the properties associated with him. Little St. James was one of them. While the criminal charges were filed in New York, investigators understood that Epstein's activities had extended across multiple jurisdictions. His residences in Florida, New York, New Mexico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands had all appeared in earlier reports and civil complaints. That made the island a relevant investigative location. Soon after the federal case began, authorities conducted searches connected to Epstein's estate and business operations. Law enforcement presence in the U.S. Virgin Islands increased, and Little St. James became part of that broader investigative effort. Search operations on the island were reported by multiple news organizations. Boats carrying investigators were seen arriving at the property. Personnel moved through buildings and grounds as part of evidence collection efforts. Photographs taken from nearby waters showed law enforcement vehicles and equipment on the island during this period. Search warrants allow investigators to collect materials potentially relevant to a case. These materials can include digital devices, documents, storage media, and physical evidence. However, detailed inventories of items seized are rarely released publicly during active investigations. For that reason, the full scope of what was collected from the island has not been completely disclosed. The timing of these searches mattered. Federal investigators were working under the framework of the criminal case filed in New York. Their objective was to gather evidence connected to specific charges involving alleged trafficking and abuse. But events soon complicated that process. In August 2019, Epstein died while in federal custody before his criminal trial could take place. His death halted the direct prosecution against him. Without a trial, many investigative details that might have been presented in court were never publicly examined in that setting. The searches themselves remain part of the documented timeline. Authorities entered the island. Evidence collection took place. The property became an active investigative site. But the absence of a completed criminal trial meant that much of the information gathered would not be tested in open court through witness testimony and cross-examination. That gap left investigators, journalists, and the public with partial visibility into what happened on the island. The physical searches confirmed the island's importance to the investigation. Yet many of the conclusions that might have emerged from a courtroom were never formally presented. Even after the death of Jeffrey Epstein in 2019, the story surrounding his private island did not end. Investigations, lawsuits, and public debate have continued for years. The properties themselves, especially Little St. James, remain powerful symbols of unanswered questions. Continued legal proceedings. Although Epstein cannot be prosecuted further, several legal processes have continued. Civil lawsuits filed by victims against Epstein's estate. Claims against individuals accused of enabling or participating in abuse. Investigations into Epstein's financial network and associates. One of the most prominent figures tied to these proceedings is Ghislaine Maxwell, who was convicted in 2021 for helping recruit and groom minors for Epstein. Victims have sought compensation through settlements with the Epstein estate and related funds established to process claims. Sale and future of the islands. After Epstein's death, both of his islands in the U.S. Virgin Islands were put up for sale. The islands were eventually purchased in 2023 by Stephen Dekoff through his investment firm SD Investments. The reported purchase price for Little St. James and Great St. James together was roughly $60 million. The buyers stated intentions to redevelop the islands into a luxury resort destination, though development plans have been controversial due to the island's association with Epstein's crimes. Public debate and transparency. The Epstein case has fueled ongoing discussions about accountability for powerful individuals, transparency in legal investigations, how wealth and influence may affect justice. The case also intensified calls to release additional records related to Epstein's contacts and travel logs. Over time, courts have unsealed portions of documents connected to the case. However, many details remain disputed, sealed, or unverified. Cultural impact. The story of Epstein's Island has become a frequent subject of investigative journalism, documentaries, podcasts, books about financial crime and elite networks. Several major documentaries and series have explored the topic, including Jeffrey Epstein, Filthy Rich, Epstein's Shadow, Ghislaine Maxwell. These productions focus heavily on survivor testimonies and the broader systemic failures that allowed Epstein to operate for years. Why the story still matters. For many observers, the Epstein Island case continues to represent broader concerns about institutional accountability, protection of vulnerable people, the influence of wealth and power in global networks. The legacy of the case remains shaped by survivor voices and the continuing push for transparency. The documents exist. The questions remain. This channel will continue examining what is public and what is still hidden. If you value documented analysis over speculation, consider subscribing. More files coming.